There was a moment when the world almost ended. No explosions, no warning sirens, no mushroom cloud in the sky, just a photograph. A grainy black and white image taken from 70,000 feet above the Earth. Inside that image were missiles, nuclear missiles, close enough to reach American cities in minutes. For 13 days in October 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union stood one decision away from nuclear war. And the terrifying part? Most people had no idea how close it really was. This is the story of the 13 days that almost ended the world. October 14, 1962. It was supposed to be routine. A U-2 spy plane lifted off from a base in Florida before dawn. High altitude, standard surveillance route. Nothing unusual. The Cold War had already normalized tension. Reconnaissance flights over Cuba were common. After all, Cuba had become something new. 90 miles from American shores, and now aligned with the Soviet Union. But that morning, the camera inside the U-2 captured something different. Rows of long cylindrical shapes, launch platforms, missile erectors, support vehicles positioned with careful symmetry. This wasn't speculation. It wasn't intelligence rumor. It was photographic evidence. Medium-range ballistic missiles, Soviet nuclear missiles. In Cuba, close enough to reach Washington, D.C. in under 15 minutes. When the film was developed and placed under analysis in Washington, intelligence officers didn't speak at first. They measured, they compared, they verified, because if they were right, the balance of power had shifted overnight. President John F. Kennedy was briefed on October 16th. He did not react dramatically. No shouting, no immediate declaration, just stillness. Because the implication was enormous. If the United States did nothing, it would signal weakness. If it invaded Cuba, the Soviets might retaliate in Berlin. If it launched airstrikes, it could trigger full-scale war. And if that war escalated, it would not be conventional. It would be nuclear. The Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM, was formed. A small group of advisors, military chiefs, intelligence officers, cabinet members. For 13 days, they would debate inside closed rooms. No cameras, no public announcements, just maps, options, and fear. The generals had a clear recommendation. Airstrike the missile sites immediately. Follow with invasion. Eliminate the threat before it becomes operational. But Kennedy hesitated because he understood something chilling. If the United States struck first, it would look like Pearl Harbor, and the Soviet Union might respond the same way the U.S. had in 1941, with total war. Meanwhile, the missiles in Cuba were becoming operational. Time was shrinking, and here is where the tension deepens. Most Americans had no idea. Life continued normally. Children went to school. People watched television. Baseball games were played. Underneath that normalcy, strategic bombers were being prepared. Nuclear submarines moved into position. Missile crews were placed on higher alert. The United States raised its defense readiness condition, DEFCON, to levels never before reached in peacetime. Behind closed doors, voices clashed. Some believed strength required immediate force. Others believed patience could prevent catastrophe. Kennedy asked the question repeatedly, if we attack, what happens next? Because it wasn't about the first move. It was about the second, and the third, and the point where neither side could step back. Intelligence estimates suggested that if nuclear war began, tens of millions could die in the first exchange. American cities incinerated, Soviet cities erased, Europe caught in the middle. And here's the unsettling truth. No one knew exactly how it would unfold. This was new territory. Mutually assured destruction wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real. Meanwhile, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was watching closely. He had deployed the missiles secretly, not purely as aggression, but as leverage. The U.S. had placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, within range of Moscow. Khrushchev believed this was strategic balancing. Kennedy saw it as escalation. Two superpowers, both armed, both proud, both convinced they could not appear weak. and between them, a small island, Cuba. By October 18th, reconnaissance confirmed additional missile sites, more launchers, more equipment. The window for decision was closing. And here's what made it even more dangerous. The U.S. did not know if the missiles were already armed with nuclear warheads. If an airstrike hit a site, would it detonate? Would Soviet commanders in Cuba launch before being destroyed? Communication delays meant Washington might not even know until explosions appeared on radar. Every option carried risk. On October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation on live television. For the first time, the American public learned the truth. Soviet nuclear missiles were in Cuba, and the United States would impose a naval quarantine, not an invasion, not an immediate strike, a blockade. The word mattered. Blockade implied war. Quarantine implied enforcement. Ships carrying military equipment to Cuba would be stopped, turned back, or seized. And now the world was watching. Soviet ships were already moving across the Atlantic. American naval forces were positioning. If a Soviet ship refused to stop, would American sailors fire? And if they fired, would Moscow respond? The first move had been made, but no one knew how the second would unfold. And as the days passed, the pressure built, because once two nuclear powers move pieces into place, it becomes harder and harder to move them back. And October 1962 was only beginning. October 23rd, 1962, the quarantine line was drawn, not on a map for the public, but across the Atlantic Ocean, an invisible boundary. Any Soviet ship carrying military cargo toward Cuba would be stopped before crossing it. American destroyers took position. Aircraft carriers moved into range. Nuclear submarines slipped beneath the surface. Strategic Air Command bombers were placed on airborne alert for the first time in history. This was no longer debate. This was execution. And now the question was simple. Would the Soviets stop, or would they test the line? Because if a Soviet cargo ship approached and refused inspection, an American captain would face a decision: fire a warning shot, board the vessel, or escalate. And escalation meant something terrifying. The Soviet Union had submarines in the region, armed submarines, some equipped with nuclear torpedoes. American intelligence did not know that detail yet, but the risk was there. On October 24th, the world held its breath. Soviet ships continued advancing. Closer, closer. Radar screens glowed in dim command rooms. Naval officers tracked movements carefully. Then, something unexpected happened. Several Soviet ships slowed, then turned. They reversed course before reaching the quarantine line. It looked like de-escalation, but it wasn't resolution, because the missiles already in Cuba were still there, still being assembled, still nearing operational status. Kennedy's advisors debated again. Airstrikes were still an option. Invasion plans were still ready. The military pressed hard. Strike now, before they're fully armed. But Kennedy understood timing. If the U.S. attacked while Soviet ships had just turned away, it would appear as American aggression. So he waited, and waiting was its own form of pressure. Meanwhile, something even more dangerous was unfolding beneath the surface. On October 27th, later called Black Saturday, events spiraled. An American U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, was killed. Now there was blood. Now there was justification for retaliation. Inside the ExComm meetings, voices grew sharper. The Joint Chiefs urged immediate response. Destroy the missile sites. Send a message. Kennedy paused again, because he suspected something critical. The missile that shot down the U-2 might not have been authorized by Moscow. It could have been a local Soviet commander acting under pressure. If Washington retaliated immediately, it might escalate a mistake into catastrophe. But events were unfolding beyond Washington's control. In the Caribbean, American destroyers detected a Soviet submarine beneath the quarantine zone. They began dropping depth charges, not to destroy it, but to signal it to surface. Inside that submarine, conditions were brutal. High heat, low oxygen, no contact with Moscow. The crew believed war might already have begun. And here's the detail that still chills historians. That submarine carried a nuclear torpedo. Standard protocol required authorization from 3 officers to launch. 2 agreed. They believed they were under attack. They believed war had started. 1 officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He insisted they surface instead. 1 vote, 1 voice, 1 refusal. If that torpedo had launched, an American destroyer would have been destroyed. The U.S. Navy would have responded. Escalation would have been immediate. But Arkhipov held his ground, and the submarine surfaced. The world never knew how close it had come in that moment. Above water, negotiations intensified. Khrushchev sent messages to Washington. The first was emotional, suggesting removal of missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The second was harder, demanding removal of American missiles from Turkey. The messages were inconsistent, urgent, almost desperate. Inside the White House, advisors debated which letter to answer. Kennedy chose carefully. He responded publicly to the first message, agreeing not to invade Cuba. Privately, through back-channel communication, he agreed to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey later. Quietly, without public linkage. It was a compromise neither side could fully admit, but it was enough. On October 28, 1962, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would dismantle its missile sites in Cuba. The crisis was ending, but the danger had been real, not symbolic, not exaggerated. Real, strategic bombers had been airborne, missile crews on hair-trigger alert, submarines armed, 1 miscalculation away from nuclear exchange. And yet, the world did not explode, not because it was stable, but because at several critical moments, men chose restraint over reaction. But here's the unsettling part. Restraint is fragile, and the Cold War was not over. The world had stepped back from the edge, but it had seen how thin that edge really was. And what came next would reshape nuclear strategy forever. October 27, 1962, later called Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cold War, and possibly the most dangerous day in human history. By this point, tension was no longer theoretical. The quarantine was in place. Missile sites in Cuba were nearing operational readiness. American forces were at DEFCON 2, 1 step below nuclear war. That level had never been reached before. Strategic bombers were airborne 24 hours a day, fully armed, pilots sleeping in shifts, missiles loaded, warheads ready. If the order came, launch time would be minutes. In Moscow, Soviet forces were also on high alert, and somewhere between those 2 superpowers, the margin for error was shrinking. That morning, the U-2 was shot down over Cuba. The wreckage fell from the sky in smoke. The pilot never had a chance. When news reached Washington, the room fell silent. This was no longer just surveillance. This was a kill. The military saw clarity in it. An act of war. Strike back. Destroy the missile sites. Demonstrate strength. But Kennedy hesitated. Again, because escalation is easier than de-escalation. And he knew that once bombs began falling, they might not stop. Meanwhile, another U-2 aircraft accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace over Siberia. A navigation error. But radar lit up in Moscow. Soviet fighter jets scrambled. American fighter jets launched to escort the lost plane back. Both sides now had armed aircraft facing each other over Soviet territory. For a few minutes, nuclear war could have started by mistake, not intention. Mistake. And as if that wasn't enough, the submarine incident intensified. The American destroyers continued signaling Soviet subs with depth charges. To the Americans, they were warnings. To the submarine crews, isolated underwater, they felt like attack. Inside Submarine B-59, Captain Valentin Savitsky believed war had already begun. He had not received communication from Moscow in days. The depth charges shook the hull. The temperature inside climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Air grew thick. Sweat dripped from ceilings. Men were exhausted. Savitsky ordered preparation of the nuclear torpedo. 2 officers agreed. They believed this was the beginning of World War III. Launching the torpedo would destroy the American ship above. It would also guarantee retaliation, but there was a third officer aboard, Vasily Arkhipov. Calm, measured, he argued against it, insisted they surface, insisted they wait. Inside that submarine, in suffocating heat under pressure, with no contact from command, one man's refusal stopped the launch. And here's what makes it chilling. Washington had no idea. If the torpedo had fired, the U.S. Navy would not have paused to analyze. They would have responded. And once nuclear weapons are used, they do not stay isolated. They multiply. Back in Washington, Kennedy faced his own choice. The Joint Chiefs pushed again. Time is running out. Strike now. But intelligence revealed something new. Khrushchev's first message, more conciliatory, arrived before the harsher demand. It suggested removing missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The second message demanded removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. The White House debated which to answer. Responding to both publicly would look like weakness. Ignoring the second could provoke Soviet escalation. Kennedy chose strategy. Publicly respond only to the first message. Privately signal willingness to remove Turkish missiles later. Quietly, without linking it publicly. It was a gamble, because Khrushchev could reject it. He could double down. He could accelerate missile activation. And time was critical. Some missile sites in Cuba were hours from operational readiness. If war began after they were active, American cities would be within immediate range. Washington, New York, Chicago, Miami. The estimates projected tens of millions dead in the first exchange. Entire regions erased. The Cold War turning into a hot one in minutes. And yet, something shifted. Khrushchev was under pressure too. He understood that escalation would destroy both nations. Both leaders were staring into the same abyss, and neither wanted to jump. On October 28th, Radio Moscow broadcast an announcement. The Soviet Union would dismantle its missile installations in Cuba in exchange for the U.S. pledge not to invade. The Turkish missiles would be removed later quietly. The crisis was over. But here's the truth most people never fully grasp. The world did not survive because it was safe. It survived because multiple times in a single week, people chose not to escalate. Kennedy chose restraint. Khrushchev chose compromise. Arkhipov chose hesitation. History hung on those choices. And that realization changes how you see power. Because the most dangerous moment in modern history did not come with a countdown. It came with silence, with debate, with doubt, with uncertainty. And the world survived. Barely. When the announcement came on October 28, 1962, there were no cheers in the streets, no fireworks, no parades, just relief, quiet, private relief, because the world had been staring into something most people couldn't fully comprehend. Not invasion, not occupation, annihilation. The Soviet Union agreed to dismantle the missile sites in Cuba. American surveillance confirmed the process. Missile casings were crated, launchers removed, ships turned back across the Atlantic. The United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. Privately, it agreed to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey months later. Quietly, without spectacle, without public acknowledgement. It was diplomacy in shadows. But it worked, and that matters, because diplomacy under pressure is not weakness. It is survival. The Cuban Missile Crisis reshaped the Cold War. It forced both superpowers to confront a terrifying reality. Nuclear weapons were no longer strategic symbols. They were immediate extinction devices. After October 1962, something changed. A direct communication line, later called the Hotline, was established between Washington and Moscow, so that next time, messages wouldn't travel through delays and misinterpretation. Nuclear doctrine evolved. Command structures tightened. Protocols adjusted. Because leaders had seen how fragile control truly was. But perhaps the most unsettling lesson is this. The world did not avoid nuclear war because systems were perfect. It avoided it because individuals exercised restraint at critical moments. Kennedy resisted military pressure. Khrushchev accepted compromise over pride. Arkapav refused a launch order inside a submarine that believed war had begun. 3 separate decisions, 3 separate locations, 1 shared outcome, survival. And here is the haunting part. None of those decisions felt heroic at the time. They felt uncertain, risky, politically dangerous. History often glorifies bold action, but in October 1962, bold restraint saved millions, and most of the world never knew how close it had come. Children went to school, parents went to work. People watched the evening news without understanding how thin the margin truly was. The Cold War continued. Proxy conflicts persisted. Arms races accelerated. But something invisible had shifted. Both sides had glimpsed the abyss. And once you glimpse it, you never quite forget. Today, nuclear weapons still exist. Missile systems are faster. Communication is instantaneous. Technology more advanced. But the lesson of those 13 days remains urgent. Power without restraint is catastrophe. Miscommunication can kill millions. And pride, when mixed with nuclear capability, is lethal. The Cuban Missile Crisis reminds us that the end of the world does not always begin with chaos. Sometimes it begins with miscalculation, with assumption, with fear interpreted too quickly. In October 1962, the world survived not because it was strong, but because it paused, because leaders, for once, allowed space for retreat, because someone, somewhere, decided not to press forward. And that is the paradox. The most powerful moment in modern history was the moment when no one pulled the trigger. Fade to black. Text on screen. October 1962. 13 days that almost ended the world. Soft radio static. Then silence. When the crisis ended, there were no victory parades, no celebration, no public handshake between enemies, just relief. Quiet, fragile relief. The missiles were dismantled, the blockade lifted, a secret deal made, and slowly, the world exhaled. But here is what makes October 1962 so unsettling. We did not avoid nuclear war because we were safe. We avoided it because a handful of men chose restraint, because one submarine officer refused to launch, because back-channel messages were read carefully, because ego paused long enough for reason to speak. The world did not survive because it was stable. It survived because, in the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, someone blinked. In the days that followed, both sides understood something chilling. They had come closer to destruction than either had publicly admitted. Missiles were minutes away. Bombers were airborne. Nuclear submarines were armed beneath the ocean. One miscommunication, one aggressive order, one panic reaction, and history would have ended differently. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed more than policy. It changed awareness. It led to the creation of the Washington-Moscow hotline. It reshaped nuclear doctrine. It reminded leaders that deterrence is a razor's edge. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed how fragile civilization really is. We often imagine the end of the world as sudden, a flash of light, a shockwave. But in October 1962, the end of the world almost came quietly, in meetings, in memorandums, in classified conversations, in pauses between sentences. And that may be the most haunting truth of all. History is not only shaped by battles and invasions. Sometimes it is shaped by silence, by hesitation, by the decision not to escalate. The world survived those 13 days, but it did not forget them. Because once you realize how close you came to losing everything, you never look at power the same way again. Fade to black. Text on screen. October 1962. 13 days that almost ended the world. Soft static radio sound. Silence.